Tormented Souls is one of those games you've probably missed. It's a survival horror game designed to mimic the early Resident Evil and Silent Hill titles. The devs were definitely successful at recreating the feel of those games, but in doing so also adopted some of their biggest problems. As a modern game, I'd expect it to feature ultrawide regardless if it pretends to be old school or not, and it does to some extent. If you select 4K in the graphical settings, Tormented Souls seems to work in 21:9 without zooming in and messing everything up. 32:9, however, is completely impossible. In addition to that, since the game isn't popular enough, nobody has bothered to make a fix, so we're stuck with 21:9. The idea of being old school has played a substantial role in Tormented Souls development. You even have the option of using tank controls, but luckily we are also offered modern alternatives. If you should play the game using a console controller, in my case it was a PS4 gamepad, you can use the D-pad for tank controls or use the analog sticks for modern ones. To be honest, I cannot imagine anyone going for the tank option, but you never know, so having it there definitely doesn't hurt the experience. What does hurt it in my opinion are the fixed cameras. I cannot tell you how often I had to fight enemies which were off screen. The main issue here is that our protagonist is barely faster than most enemies, meaning that kiting them then turning around and firing is not a very good option. In games like Resident Evil, the zombies were almost always really slow, so it was no problem to kite them to a location where the camera will allow you to see them better. Here, running around just means that I'm losing my first strike advantage, and the enemies will most likely close in a lot by the time I manage to move where I want to be so that I can actually see them and raise my weapon. Due to this, more often than not, you'll find yourself forced to shoot an enemy which you cannot see because of the camera. At first it didn't seem so bad, but as the game went on, this happened more and more often. On some occasions, I actually got hit since I tried to move to a different location, hoping that the camera angle would change and I'd be able to see my target. Since you can't actually see where the enemy is, moving around means risking ending up close to your attacker. It essentially is a choice between a potential loss of ammo or health. You either shoot at what you cannot see and potentially miss, or you move around in order to force a camera change but end up taking a hit in the process, and sometimes more than one. And speaking of enemies, this game doesn't have too many of them, but where it fails in terms of quantity, it delivers in terms of quality. Every enemy in the game has a grotesque appearance, good sound design, and is generally speaking scary. Combine that with the fact that you will sometimes have to fight them in barely lit areas, you can probably see how this could get your blood pumping. There is one enemy which I really did not like, however. It's the floating monster. It's completely invulnerable and will spawn in rooms at random during the last third of the game. Luckily, all you have to do is exit the room and re-enter for it to despawn. I just hate the idea of enemies who cannot die. You're in this very tight space, being chased by this relatively fast enemy, and it's just a pain in the ass. It's not fun to deal with it. Now let's talk about level design. First and foremost, I have to say that I was truly impressed with the attention to detail here. Every room in the game looks great. There's so much stuff here, and one can tell that the devs were passionate about this project. You are in a mansion which was repurposed as a hospital. Similarly to Resident Evil and Silent Hill, there are plenty of weird locks which require special keys, as well as a bunch of puzzles. Some involve traveling to alternate hellish universes by traversing through a mirror. In addition to that, there's some time travel mechanics involved as well. All of this offers interesting challenges in the environment and provides tools to craft a more intricate story, but unfortunately, this is where the developers have failed in my eyes. The story is bland and very predictable. In addition to that, it doesn't explain a lot of things which happen. Why is there time travel? What's up with the hellish dimension? At one time, our character does something in one dimension in order to solve a puzzle in another. Her actions are very deliberate, and the result is obviously what we want. What I found annoying was that she was completely confused about the puzzle being solved in the normal world. I mean, why would she do all the things she did in the hellish dimension if not exactly in order to solve the puzzle in the real one? It would make no sense otherwise. Not to mention that you are essentially solving the almost identical puzzle in hell and then seeing it having been solved in the real world. It's logical. A child would understand what just happened. The same with opening paths. Something is blocking you from progressing in one dimension, so you go into another, remove the obstruction, and then return to the original one in order to progress with the story. Do they really mean to tell me that the character is clueless when it comes to these things, especially after having just done them? That's just stupid. You also find lots of written diaries which are supposed to flesh out the world. Some of them supposedly written by children, but those children seem to have degrees in literature or something, because no child writes like this. So as you can see, the narrative has many problems. Let's take a look at the game's puzzles next. Tormented Souls has quite a few of them, and I found most to be way too difficult for me. Be aware that I'm not the most intelligent person, so I know that there will always be people out there who will be able to solve all the puzzles and even consider them easy. But for me, they were too challenging. In addition to that, I found it difficult to continue with the game, something that has never been the case with Silent Hill or Resident Evil. There was a point when I was literally running around for about 2 hours before I gave up and checked the guide. That to me is a red flag. Figuring out what to do next is made even worse when you take a look at the map. It doesn't track your location, so you have to figure out where you are and where you want to be on your own, which is a very difficult task at first. Luckily, it at least marks major puzzles and locations at which you can save. And speaking of saving, let's talk about that. You are only allowed to save at specific locations and only if you actually own the necessary item, which then expires, meaning that you have to ration your saves. While the game is not very difficult, I did have a few moments where I had died and lost about 30 minutes worth of progress. The game doesn't even do you the courtesy of offering you at least a few autosaves. This limitation is definitely too old school for me, and altogether with the fixed cameras were responsible for my frustration on several occasions. I honestly believe that there should be an option to choose more modern playstyles. The Resident Evil 2 remake is a great example of how you can capitalize on nostalgia while still making the game more modern. This seems to be a good time for me to tell you about the game's voice acting and music. The voice acting is okay. Obviously, this is an independent title, so they didn't hire any famous voice actors, but I actually approve of that. Let some new blood into the industry. Some people suspect that the weaker performances in terms of voice acting were deliberate, since the old school survival horrors had some hardcore examples of that. I'm thinking Resident Evil 1. But I am pretty confident that this was not intended. Regardless, I find the voice acting to be absolutely sufficient. As for the music, it's surprisingly good. I don't have to tell you how important it is for a survival horror game to have decent music. The music is what controls the emotions of the players. You enter a safe room, you hear the calming melody, you're immediately relaxed knowing that you are safe. You enter a random room, you hear tense music, you prepare for trouble. Music is very important, and I'm glad that the devs recognized this. Ultimately, it took me 8.5 hours to complete Tormented Souls. You have to consider, however, that I was extra slow at first, and then quite fast once I started following a guide. I can definitely say that the game time is very good, although I have to say that there will be a lot of backtracking. There's some replayability since you do have 3 endings. All in all, considering the fact that it only costs €20, I'd have to say that I can recommend Tormented Souls. It has problems, some of them quite serious ones, but it's still very enjoyable, especially if you are someone who really likes survival horror. Personally, I'm a fan of such games, and therefore my sensitivity for the horror aspects has been dulled a bit. Luckily, there are only a few jump scares here, so most of the horror will be coming from anticipating things rather than what you actually see or any kind of jump scares. So if you are like me and you like these kind of games, I advise you to give this one a chance, but also be prepared to use a guide. The game doesn't mess around when it comes to the difficulty of the puzzles. Some of them are crazy cryptic. With that having been said, thank you for watching Game Filter. I hope this review was informative and entertaining. It will make me very happy if you took a look at my other reviews as well. See you next time. This is Nino, signing out.